So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to John. Very much thank him for coming, and I'll let him talk, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I'm very happy to be here and present for this audience. It's not my first visit to Australia, but well, it's the third actually. But this is the first time I've been able to spend time working together with Australian researchers, and I really enjoy that, and I enjoyed the program until now today. I'm John Thøgersen. That's how it's pronounced in Danish. From the Aarhus University, I'm a professor of economic psychology, and I've been heading research on marketing and sustainability and consumption and sustainability since the late 80s at that place. There's much more now than there used to be, but and it's going well, I would say. This is where I come from. I can't be more specific, but since you sent us Mary, I'm sure many of you will know that this is where it is. This is Denmark. A very small place, actually, but so is the Earth. And, well, I think it's increasingly clear for all of us that the Earth is a very limited place for all the people that we have there. And that this challenge of such a finite planet that we have actually urged us to be responding quickly at some of the problems that we are facing. And that's part of the background for what I'm talking about today. I think most of you are probably familiar with the calculations of the world footprint, finding that it now takes the Earth 1 year and 6 months to regenerate what we use in 1 year, and that's clearly on an increasing trend. That's obviously not sustainable. It's something we need to do something about. It's something that we need to do something radical about, and it's urgent. This is something that's, of course, increasingly realized by governments all over the world. This is, I here share with you a quote from the most recent report on the state of the European environment from the European Environment Agency. It says here that continuing depletion of Europe's stock of natural capital and flows of ecosystem services will ultimately undermine Europe's economy and erode social cohesion. Most of the negative changes are driven by growing use of natural resources to satisfy production and consumption patterns. The result is a significant environmental footprint in Europe and elsewhere. So there is a clear understanding that we are on a track that's not sustainable, and we need to do something about it. Physicist David McKay wrote in 2009 about specifically focusing on energy and the energy-related problems, including global warming, that this quote here, have no illusions to achieve our goal of getting out of fossil fuels. Reductions in demand and increases in supply of renewables must be big. Don't be distracted by the myth that every little helps. If everyone does a little, we'll achieve only a little. We must do a lot. What is required are big changes in demand and supply. So what he's saying here is it's urgent. We need to do a lot, and that the small voluntary changes that people may do in their everyday life as consumers, that each of us may do in our everyday life, are simply too small, simply too inconsequential. We need to do a lot. And what that of course means that many the governments around the world, and NGOs for that matter, are increasingly also asking people to change their behavior to change their consumption patterns in a more sustainable way. There are different approaches to behavior change that are picked up. And by far the most common approach, that, like what you would say is the natural approach by regulators, is what one could call a piecemeal approach. Or we'll cross that bridge when we come to an approach, or simply whenever a problem occurs, we try to design a campaign where we influence people and make them change their behaviors. This is a way where we take one step at a time, a piecemeal approach that is not very fast. It has its backing in research saying, for instance, research by social marketeers pointing out that all behaviors are unique, so we do need to design different campaigns targeting the unique situation of each different behavior. But of course, one of the issues with this approach is it's slow. I mean, it takes a long time. And we need to look beyond these selected individual problems and look at the bigger pictures. And how can we work with behaviors facing the bigger pictures? And there's different approaches to looking at behavior in the bigger picture. One approach that was proposed by Paul Stern and Gardner in an article in The Environment a couple of years ago proposed a short list. What they proposed was that rather than recommending people 50 things that you can do for the environment, and there's all kinds of self-help guides that try to educate people on many different things they can do in everyday life. Researchers and authorities should analyze the various behaviors that people do and point out, where did we get most bang for the buck? What are the behavior changes that are really effective in solving our problem? And in a more recent article, he and his colleagues in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States did these calculations for the United States and pointing out, what are the behaviors, everyday behaviors that really matters, and then they recommended that we should recommend 6 to 9 behaviors and focus on that, and then really push for making these changes. That would matter. Well, part of this is what they're doing here. They look at the bigger picture, they look at behaviors, and they differentiate what's most effectively. But the argument for doing so is to a high extent that by giving people these long lists, 50 things to do for the environment, you tend to confuse people, and you tend to exhaust them, and you might even make them think that when they have done a couple of small things, they have already done their bit. That's actually implying that behaviors are interlinked. It's kind of an engineering approach to behavior change, like looking at effectiveness. But it's also implying that behaviors are not just independent, and behavior campaigns therefore should not be seen as independent, but there are links between them. It has consequences. If you do one type of behavior, you may not necessarily do another one effectively. There's another approach that's recently being proposed that also look at behavior dependence, but more from a marketing perspective. It's talking about identifying catalytic behaviors. That is, behaviors that can knock on to other behaviors. And the basic idea is get people on board using small and easy things, and then that will prepare the grounds for making them do more difficult things that have more impact. That of course also looks at and at least assumes that there is a link between behaviors, that what we do in one area matters for what we would do in other areas. This approach was or at least the term catalytic behaviors was proposed by DEFRA, the UK government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. In 2008, in a report, They talked about needing to promote a range of behaviors as entry points and helping different groups to make their lifestyles more sustainable, including catalytic or wet behaviors if identified through research. And of course, with this whole approach hinged fundamentally on the idea that what we do in one area is relevant for what we will do in other areas. That there might be some kind of what I have termed a spillover from green behaviors in one area to green behaviors in other areas. But, and in this way, like if that's the case, that could perhaps help us speed up the process. And that's at least the reason why I became interested in this area, was like as an amplifier. Is there a mechanism that could help us amplify the effect of behavioral campaigns so that, you know, in response to the urgency of the situation as I spoke about. But if there is a link between behaviors, if behaviors are relevant for each other, can we be absolutely sure that that link is positive? Couldn't there be a negative link between behaviors? Might it be, as stated in this article in The Guardian in 2010, that green behaviors make you mean? And they cite a study that I'll look more into, a study on more licensing in the environmental field, and a study that apparently found that green consumers are more likely to lie and steal after they have bought green stuff. And that's, of course, not a pleasant thought, if that should be the case. I don't know how many green consumers I got right now. But it also, of course, would completely undermine the whole idea that we could use like an amplifier, like spillovers of green behaviors. So I think it's time to tell you my outline of my talk. And what I've spoken about until now is like the challenge that is motivating this whole stream of research, and I've introduced to you two basic ideas that goes in the opposite direction, namely the possibility of catalytic behaviors, where small steps might lead to bigger steps, and more licensing, where small steps might lead to lying and stealing or whatever, so perhaps you will steal your green goods next time. And what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk is like I present to you some of the research on these two things. I'm not going to do a review of the whole area of research in spillover, but just point out some illustrative examples of positive and negative research on positive and negative. And specifically, I'll show you the study that The Guardian was referring to, and a study of my own where I look at whether doing small green behaviors by yourself might lead to people being more accepting of more radical policy measures in the future. And then at the end, I'll share with you some reflection on like if there is such a thing as positive spillover, how can we optimize it? So first, let's look at the idea of more licensing, or what's also being called a compensatory ethics, that what you do in one area, I mean, if you do something bad in one area, you can compensate for it by doing something good in other areas. This is basically, it's researched by Song and his colleagues on that's kind of led into this area of Song is one of the authors behind that piece that was in The Guardian. Based this research on basic research by Higgins on self-discrepancy theory, where like Higgins' idea was that you have a desire, a moral self, that act as a reference point for your evaluation of your own behavior. And if you act in a way that deviates from that moral self, that creates a sense of distress, emotional distress in you, that motivates you to do something to compensate. so that people who have done something bad are more likely to do something good afterwards, to compensate for the bad they've just done. Others, like Bandura, have said that, okay, it could be like sometimes if it's too difficult to do something bad, they may just post-rationalize and justify what they've done, just deny that it wasn't so morally wrong what they did. But that's not like, the Song's major point is like, taking the point of departure in this research showing that when people do something bad, they may be more likely to do something good afterwards. And he likens this to a rubber band. So it says like when your self-perception deviates from your ideal moral image, then that rubber band is stretched and produces a greater motivating force, dragging you back into line, into your real line. But then he then says that this mechanism, this compensatory mechanism, and that Song, it's not Higgins, can be reversed. So it produces a sense of entitlement to some more laxity when you perceive your behavior as matching or even exceeding your ideal self. Now, it's in this last bullet that I part ways with Song. I think he's stretching the evidence too far, or at least he's stretching the argument, I would say, too far. Think about it. What's the opposite of a stretched rubber band? A rubber band cannot be negatively stretched. The opposite is a relaxed rubber band. So, like, the alternative idea would be that when you meet your moral self, when you live up to your moral self, or perhaps even exceed it, you are in a relaxed state. You're not particularly alert to do something good. You're just your normal self, like you're just the normal amount of alertness, but you're not kind of feeling more laxity or entitlement to do something bad. So I would say, like, the theoretical basis for claiming that there is a negative effect, actually, at least it's not found in Higgins' work, and we still need research showing that that is the case. I should say that the whole idea of licensing has been found in other areas, non-moral areas of research. I mean, it's been found that, for instance, when a person has exercised, the person is more likely to think that it's okay to eat a cookie, for instance. So that, I mean, you have already done one thing, so you can do a thing that you would else perhaps not do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it extends to this area. But let me share with you the research that Song and his colleague did on the licensing effect of acting in a pro-environmental way. They did a number of experiments, Song and his colleagues, using Toronto undergrad students exposed to two conditions. A random half of the students were shopping in a green store, and the other half of the students were shopping in a conventional store. Each of them were asked to shop for $25. That was the limit. They could choose less, but there wasn't the incentive that there would be a drawer, so some of the students would receive the products that they chose in the store, a random number of students, and they would only receive the products that they chose. So if they only bought for less than $25, they would get products worth less than $25 if they won the lottery. The store was designed like this. There was an online store where the students were asked here to pick a number of the goods here. They could only pick one of each. And then there was a counter counting how much money they had used. In the green, in both stores there were 12 products. In the green store, 9 of these 12 products were green, 3 were conventional. In the conventional store, 9 were conventional, 3 were green. That's the only difference. Then, after having completed this shopping, then the students, the participants were told, and now there's a different experiment that some other researchers want to do. And in this experiment, they were asked to allocate 20 dots on the screen, divided on left and right side of a line, and report whether there were more dots on the left side or on the right side. They were paid half a cent for each of the times they said there was most on the left side, and 5 cents each of the time they said there was most on the right side. And it was always clear which side has most dots. And there was 90 trials in total. 40% of the trials there were more dots on the right side than on the left side. And then, after having finished that, there was a counter again on the screen saying how much they had earned, and they were asked to help themselves to the money from an envelope that was on their table, including up to $5 in change. That's the situation. And how did the two groups respond? Well, the students, those that shopped in the conventional store, they were pretty exact in pointing out that in 40% of their trials, there were more dots on the right side than on the left side. But those that shopped in the green store, suddenly there were more on the right side, more on the side that paid more. So they tended to exaggerate how many times there were more dots on the right side than on the green side. Actually, so the total was 52%. And this difference is statistically significant. So, well, one might say, some of them lied, didn't they? They said that there were more dots in the side that paid more, just because they had shopped in the green store, and they didn't know that was why, but they had shopped in the green store and they were more likely to lie. And when it came to helping themselves to money, there was also a significant difference in how much extra money they took from the envelope that was set on the screen. And actually those in the conventional store, that amount is not significantly different from zero, but it is in the other case that they actually helped themselves to 58 cents more on average than they were entitled to based on what was on the screen. Some would call this stealing, wouldn't they? And that's the evidence showing that these people were more likely to lie and steal when they have been shopping in the green store, and therefore were green consumers. But what does this research really say? Does it say that green consumers are more likely to lie and steal? Definitely not. I hope most of you will agree, although this is a really funny experiment, that that's not what it shows. Why not? Why doesn't it show that? Well, basically because these were not green consumers. We had a bunch of people, a random half of young students buying green, not because they wanted to, but because of lack of choice. That's not like the way, I mean, how many of us are ever in a store where we can only buy green because of lack of choice? I mean, green consumers buy green because they want to buy green, because they're motivated to buy green, not because they're forced to buy green. So these are definitely not green consumers, they're something else. What are they then? Well, I mean, one could speculate, of course, but my speculation would be that what we see in this experiment is that young people with a weak moral character, and there's in any random sample there will be some with a weak moral character, and they would rarely buy green, I would say. That these people are more likely to fall for temptations, in this case temptations to lie and steal, when the situation has bestowed them with moral credentials of any kind. And of course, we know from other types of research that there is a slippery slope, so if you, like, lying may lead to stealing. So, This research is funny and interesting, and it does show that there is such a thing as more licensing, but it doesn't show that buying green make people be more likely, real people outside the lab, be more likely to do bad things afterwards. So the real trend is not, I think, it's not that doing something small for the environment will make it more likely that people will do something bad afterwards, like steal the next organic food instead of buying it. The real risk is that it's inconsequential, that people do something small for the environment and that's that. They don't do anything more. That's what we should be concerned about. That there will be no knock-on effect, no spillover effect. So let us look at the possible positive spillover effect and what do research say about the possibility of a positive spillover effect. Well, there is actually not so much really strong evidence in this area. There is a number of, especially psychological theories, that predict or that point at mechanisms that might produce a positive spillover effect. For instance, there's something called goal theory, which says that, and has shown empirically, that if you do something towards a certain goal, that action tends to make that goal more salient in your mind. And because the goal is more salient, you will also be more attentive to other possibilities that pops up to work toward that same goal. So, meaning if you do something for the environment because you want to protect the environment, the goal of protecting the environment becomes more salient to you, and therefore you're more likely to notice other things you could do for the environment and therefore do them. Another theory that predicts spillover is self-perception theory. That theory suggests that when people do something, for instance for the environment, that can be self-defining. So if you do something for the environment, you will be more likely to perceive yourself as an environmentally friendly person, and therefore you would be more likely to do other things that an environmentally friendly person would do. This could be like supplemented with a theory called cognitive dissonance theory that says that when you perceive your actions to be inconsistent, that creates discomfort, dissonance in you, and that could be a motivating force in itself. And then there are a number of learning theories that also would predict spillover. For instance, Bandura's self-efficacy theory assumes that, and there's a lot of evidence supporting that perhaps the most important source of self-efficacy is experience with doing something, like experiencing that you can actually do something. Then you get more trust in your own efficacy and become more likely to do something more. And so the idea is like that self-efficacy construct might be broader than the initial behavior, and therefore it could spill over to other behaviors. Like, so if you learn you can do something good for the environment, you may be more likely to believe you can do something more for the environment. And also the other mechanism here about skills and knowledge is kind of a learning by doing mechanism. It's more saying that many things that you can do for the environment demand some specific skills that you might learn from doing the first thing, but these skills may then be relevant for doing other things as well. For instance, I did a study on the adoption of a new eco-label in Denmark, which was like when the Marine Stewardship Council label for sustainable fishery was introduced in the Danish market. And one of the things we found was that the more people use other eco-labels when they're shopping, the more the more quickly they adopted the new label. So that's kind of knowing labels, knowing eco-labels, knowing what they're good for, knowing that experiencing that they actually help you making your decisions as a green consumer is a skill that can then carry over to other behaviors. So there may be such mechanisms. When looking at some of like the evidence out there, like the empirical evidence on positive spillover, most of that evidence is simply correlation studies. Studies that investigate whether there is a correlation between different green behaviors. And there's quite large studies that report positive correlations between various pro-environmental behaviors. And I have yet to see a study that report negative correlations. I've never seen a study reporting negative correlations. And of course, a correlation does not prove that there is a causality. But if there was a strong negative spillover effect going on, we should see negative correlations sometimes, but we don't. It's also found in this correlational research that behaviors that are closer to one another, that people put in the same taxonomic categories, tend to be more strongly correlated than behaviors within different taxonomic categories. And behaviors that are more similar or perceived as more similar to people tend to be more correlated than behaviors that are less similar. And of course, these two last types of research here, well, they interest in many ways, but one of the things that they do is they question the idea of catalytic behaviors, the basic idea that doing small things that are perhaps not so consequential will lead you to be more likely to do big things with bigger consequences, because the big things are likely to be quite different from the small things. So in that way, that finding is actually not so pleasant for this already. Let me just present like one correlation study, but what I did here is I found from a database, there's a data storage in Cologne where you can find all kinds of data. And this is a huge survey that was made in 2000 in a large number of countries with I think there was 31,000 respondents. And in this survey, people were asked a number of questions about their behavior, and these four behaviors were reported in the survey, like how much you recycle, how much you try to drive less, if you're willing to pay higher taxes for the environment, and if you perform various citizen behaviors to the extent to which you do that in order to promote an environmental agenda. And as you can see, they're all positive. All the numbers you see in this table here are positive, so it's all positive correlation showing that these behaviors tend to go together. I don't know if everybody knows what a correlation is, but the correlation can go from -1 to +1. If it's 0, the two things are completely unrelated. If it's +1, they're completely positively related, and if it's -1, they're completely negatively related. So in these cases here, they're not very strong, but they're all positive. But notice also that behavior that seem to be more similar, like these two everyday behaviors are more correlated than they are correlated with the other ones, and these two that are more like public sphere behaviors have a stronger correlation than with the other two ones here. So again, well, at least consistent with what I said before, that behaviors that are more similar are more correlated. In order to discuss the idea that behaviors can be catalytic and go from small to more consequential behavior, we need kind of classified behaviors into what is more and less consequential. And I used work by Paul Stern, who published an article on environmentally significant behaviors back in 2000. And one of his groups of behaviors, but only one that is significant for the environment, are private sphere private sphere environmentalism. That's about the things that we do as private consumers. And most of this research and the small behaviors that we talk about are in what the category he called behavior modification or curtailment behavior. That's kind of switching off the light when you leave a room, switching off the faucet when you brush your teeth and stuff like that. These are the small everyday behaviors, and these are the ones that are often looked upon as possible knock-ons to more important behaviors. More important behaviors could, for instance, be consumer investments. That is, retrofitting your house or changing your SUV to a small energy efficient car, stuff like that. Actually, there's very little research, if any. I mean, I've only seen draft papers. I haven't really seen any research that really studied that link, and it's also difficult to study. But there's also other, so most of the studies on spillover look at only the small behaviors, the containment behaviors. There's other behaviors that one can study. For instance, we're not only private consumers, we also work. We are members of leisure organizations. And of course, it could be that what we do in one area will spill over into other areas. And so there's been studies showing that if people recycle at work, they're more likely to recycle at home, and perhaps also the other way around. That would be also a type of spillover. And then there are various public sphere behaviors, and Stern distinguished between like what he called non-activist behavior in the public sphere and environmental activism. And actually his idea is that these behaviors might be much more important than many of our private behaviors would be. So that it would be relevant to look at whether our private green behavior spills over until public behaviors, including support for environmental policy. And that's actually what I'm going to look at now in what I'm talking about next here. So, in a paper that I published a couple of years ago together with Tom Crompton from UK, we discussed this exact idea of policy acceptance as a very important matter to discuss in order to promote an environmental agenda. We discussed evidence indicating that political leaders and policymakers often feel hampered by too little public acceptance of fundamental regulatory change that could actually have a big impact on the environment. That the difficulty of achieving the acceptance of the electorate is often a major cause of inadequate government action to meet the environmental challenges, and therefore if one could promote or get a higher level of public acceptance of politics, that would give sympathetic policymakers the space they would need in order to promote the necessary policy. And this is a real issue. I mean, I think you know that from many different cases. But let me take the case of policy to change out of fossil fuel into renewable energy. How do we do that? Well, it involves specific technologies. And one of the fast-growing technologies in this area is wind power. But as you will know, I'm pretty sure that's the case also in Australia, but in many countries, the expansion of wind power is hampered by resistance from the electorate. This is from a report from the Independent United States saying that local planning logjams are preventing renewable power projects being given the green light, according to research that reveals that 2 out of 3 applications for onshore wind farms have been rejected. So these 3 schemes have been turned down by local authorities in the past 18 months, only 15 were approved, a study found. And I think that that's something you can find many places, that expansion of renewable energy is actually hampered by political resistance. Even in Denmark, this small country that hosts the world's largest wind power company, Vestas, and has an extremely ambitious plan for expanding wind power. Last year there was a lot of resistance by locals and others when they wanted to do a test facility for wind energy in a rather remote area, but which has some natural beauty, I have to admit. So even in Denmark, you will see quite a lot, and there's an organization for resistance against wind energy, even in Denmark. So everywhere, people like policymakers, and that's just an example, need to face potential political resistance. So there's been, we need to study how we can create acceptance of environmental policy, and this has been studied. For instance, in the transport area, it's been found that acceptability of environmental policies is generally higher when people are aware and concerned about environmental problems, so it's linked to environmental concern, but also that, for instance, in the case of congestion charges in Stockholm, the two most important factors predicting acceptance was general environmental attitudes and beliefs about the charge's effectiveness. People support measures that they think is effective. In general, this is a review study that found that policies that target big steps are generally more positively evaluated than those that target the small steps. So people care about effectiveness. They want measures that really work. In the article by Crompton and myself, we also pointed out that it would be extremely important to investigate whether these simple steps that people might do would lead to building public acceptance of an even demand for far-reaching government interventions. And at that time, we couldn't find any research on that. So, I'm going to present some research on that, but I want to say that, of course, as I said before, just finding a positive correlation between everyday green behaviors and support for environmental policies would not be sufficient. It wouldn't prove that the adoption of a simple everyday behavior change will increase support for environmental policies. We would need to be sure that that correlation is not caused by just environmental concern. That when people are environmentally concerned, they might do both the green things and they might express support for environmental policies. I got a chance to study whether there is such a relationship, if there is a spillover effect from green behaviors to acceptance. When I visited the University of Maine last year, where I got involved in a study of the acceptance of wind power in the state of Maine in the United States. We did a survey where we measured environmental concern, green consumerism, and the acceptance of wind power. So it was possible with these data to investigate whether there is a relationship between green consumerism and acceptance of wind power while controlling for environmental concern. And as we assumed, we found a pretty strong relationship between environmental concern and the acceptance of wind power. We also found a strong correlation from environmental concern to green consumerism. But most importantly, we found that when environmental concern is controlled, green consumerism has a significant and pretty strong additional effect. So, predicting the acceptance of wind power in this case here. So, what we can conclude from this study is that the positive correlation between green consumerism and the acceptance of wind power is not just due to both of them being rooted in general environmental concern, but if a person acts pro-environmentally, even in a small way, this in itself seems to increase the acceptance of and support for wind power over and above just being environmentally concerned. So doing something for the environment has an added effect on policy acceptance, in this case, acceptance of wind power. So, I mean, that, if this is supported by other studies, and especially by like experimental studies, that tends to support the idea that promoting green everyday behaviors may have prepared the ground for increasing acceptance of more far-reaching changes in this population. Of course, policymakers still have to have the courage to take advantage of this and decide the necessary policies. Then, okay, so in some, there is some evidence and in support of the idea. There's both theory and evidence that support the idea that there might be such a thing as a catalytic behavior, there might be such a thing as a spillover, but still more research is needed. But if there is such a thing, what can we do about it? Are there something that we can do to optimize the chances of positive spillover? And I've listed here a number of things that I derived from the research that could be used to help facilitate such a positive spillover. Basically, all of the studies that point at the possible positive spillover involve some kind of concern and knowledge about environmental problems. So one still needs to educate people. Education about the problems. But what one might add here is linking the problem to the important things that really matters for solving the problem. The important things that you can do in your everyday life would be an added message that people should take home. We saw that similarities matters for spillover, so one might promote how behaviors are similar. I think many of you probably have shopped in bookstores such as the Amazon, where like every time you log in, you get the message that other people who bought this book here also were interested in that other book. One could actually do this here also. So other people who recycle also bicycle to work, or other people who recycled and bought green stuff also voted yes to this environmental legislation. The third thing that one could do would strengthen people's sense of being an environmentally concerned citizen by praising them. Many things that we do for the environment we don't necessarily consider really something we do for the environment. There might be other reasons for doing it, but then like getting praise for doing this for the environment actually has been shown to activate a spillover. So that people see themselves more as environmental persons. Make it easier, always a good thing. Remove behavior barriers. There's research showing that when you make it easier, there's more spillover. Be selective, promote the behaviors that really matters. People want effective solutions. And one might also consider using modeling in order to at least reduce the likelihood of some of the negative effects. Modeling to create more realistic perceptions of what is a fair contribution might also play out. Okay, thank you for your attention, and it took a couple of minutes longer than I told Liam, but there should still be time for some questions.